Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. This particular video will be the first in a series of horror-themed top 10s I wanted to do because it's a fun challenge to try and rank your own personal favorites top 10s of any particular genre. And in the realms of classic horror, there is no real name that looms over the entirety of the genre more than the classic Universal horrors, even more so than the classic Hammer horrors. And I wanted to start this series of top tens with a basic Universal horror top 10, but I had to try and just to even be able to get it to a simple 10, I decided to limit it specifically to the core titles known as the Universal Monsters films. So basically all the films in the various cycles built around the classic monster characters, even though that's very it's a term that gets thrown around a lot, and it usually cuts out all the other great Universal horrors of the 30s and 40s outside of the classic monster characters. So again, this is specifically just focusing on films within that cycle or within the idea of the classic Universal horrors, primarily of the 30s, but going into the Silver Age of horror in the 1940s, with one exception that's sort of is a little bit outside of that, but I include it here because its importance is so great that I just have to include it in here. So without further ado, this is my top 10 personal favorite and what I think are the greatest of the Universal horrors stacked up against the entirety of the Universal horror canon, which again is quite vast, especially in comparison to what you usually see in home video box sets. So coming in at number 10 is a favorite film of mine that I watch every year. It's one of those films that as soon as I saw it, it just became a dear favorite. And that, of course, is 1940's The Mummy's Hand, the first of the Mummy sequels, and really is sort of retconning a reboot of the Mummy franchise, and it started the Mummy cycle of the 1940s. So it does have some tangential links to the 1932 original masterpiece starring Boris Karloff, directed by Karl Freund, but it very much does its own thing, and it has the horror elements, but it's also very much a classic adventure serial style film. So I feel this film has a great influence on the Indiana Jones series, particularly Raiders of the Lost Ark. And I don't know if it's ever been named as such, but as soon as I first saw it, it was one of those where's this been all my life type experiences. So it basically builds upon the Mummy formula that is established in the original film. And rather shamelessly, when they do the flashback scene, it does reuse some footage from the original film, and that would become a sort of running gag in the series. But this is where we get the setup of the slow-walking, lumbering mummy that is under the control of the newest priest in charge of the priests of Karnak that are around just to protect the tomb of Ananka. So all that terminology and the brew of the Tana leaves and everything, that starts here. So if you ever wondered where we go from the poetic qualities of the 1932 original Karloff version of the Mummy to the more traditional lumbering mummy that is under the charge of some nefarious secret priesthood or something, it starts in the Mummy's Hand. And while I feel the rest of the sequels do have their own charms, this one's my particular favorite. I think it's the only one that really stands on its own as a really strong experience to return to. But of course, my tastes are for adventure serials of the 30s and 40s does sort of play into that. It has fantastic character actors, and it's so well done, and it's such a joy to watch every time. I also think that Tom Tyler playing the titular mummy Karis has a certain physicality that's not there when Lon Chaney Jr. takes over the role, which of course is a role he detested and did not want to do. So I think that makes a difference as well. So that's why it's my number 10. It's a fantastic film if you've never seen it. It's one of those films I like to show people. It's very short, clocks in, just over an hour like most of the Universal films. And even though it is in the new Universal of the 40s sort of streamlining of the horror films into B programmers for kids, it's the one that packs the most punch of the Mummy films, literally. and it's a nice bridge between the 1932 original and the rest of the 40 sequels. So after a lot of hemming and hawing, at number 9 is a title that definitely is an outlier in the Universal horrors. It's not technically a horror film, but it is part of one of the monster cycles, and that, of course, is part of the Invisible Man series, which, when you examine film by film, I think is probably actually the strongest overall of all the Universal monster cycles. So at number 9, I have The Invisible Woman from 1940. And for anyone who knows, The Invisible Woman actually goes in a completely different, a whole different path, really, because it's actually a screwball comedy. It's not a horror film, and the method of invisibility is acquired from literally the absent-minded old professor played by John Barrymore in one of his late career roles when he was, the industry thought he was on the skids. But it's just a wonderful experience. Like The Mummy's Hand, it's one of those films that when I finally saw it, I went in thinking, oh, this isn't going to be very good. It doesn't have a good reputation. And then this is a comedy. How will this work? It's just a delight. It's an absolute delight every time. It gets better every time you see it. You still have the amazing effects work by John P. Fulton, who had worked on all the Invisible Man films, and with each one, he got better and better, and sort of it fine-tuned the process. The performances are great across the board. Again, a fantastic roster of character actors. But what's most amazing is the timing of all of the comedy gags, the sight gags, and of course all the gags built into the whole notion of invisibility. They're perfectly executed in times. This is really one of the great screwball comedies, and it goes unnoticed because it is always packaged in the horror realm. So, admittedly, this is breaking a little bit outside of the horror genre, but it is part of the Invisible Man series, and I just adore it. Every time I see it, it's an absolute delight. It never gets old. It moves very quickly, and if you're a fan of screwball comedies and you haven't seen this, admittedly, some of the jokes do lean towards the goofier side, since you do have literally one of the Three Stooges actually appearing in the cast. But for the most part, it's wonderful to see how the invisibility sort of plays into more of a traditional screwball comedy type setup. And you have, again, a fantastic cast with many actors who did other great screwball comedies. And on top of that, you've got John Barrymore, who, again, even though he was really in the throes of the late period of his career where alcoholism had really, pushed him over the brink and things, and it was harder for him to get work and harder for him to perform, he's excellent as this character. Again, there's absolutely nothing that's really a detractor about this. Just that it's not a horror film, and you go into it expecting, oh, it's an Invisible Woman. And it's just marvelous fun. So that's why it's my number 9. It's this and The Mummy's Hand are the two I threw in here simply because they're the most joy I get out of the later 1940s films in terms of the sequels. And coming in at number 8 is another one of the iconic Universal classics, and that is, of course, 1941's The Wolfman, which is, for me, I think the line in the sand. I think it's the last truly great Universal horror masterpiece, and basically it is one of the key films of the Silver Age of horror that really kicked off with Son of Frankenstein. But if you look at the sort of trajectory of Universal horror, once the Laemmle family lost the studio and it became the new Universal, about sort of creating a streamlined factory assembly line type of production, and there was the gap period in between, basically ending the golden age of horror, 1935-36, with Dracula's Daughter. And then there were no horror films produced until Son of Frankenstein in 1939, which reinstigated the whole horror genre. That was produced as an A film, and everything else pretty much became a B film with the exception of The Wolfman. And it was ridiculously successful on its release, and it does have that mark of distinction and quality to it, I think primarily because of the director, George Wagner, trying to really push it in terms of trying to keep that eloquence of the earlier horror films of the 1930s. And, of course, it's capped off by the incredible lead, iconic performance of Lon Chaney Jr. in his signature role as Larry Talbot, the tragic character who, of course, becomes the Wolfman. But what I find most interesting about it every time is the way the film develops is very much based around how the original screenplay was supposed to be all psychological. The original Kurt Siodmak proposal and screenplays where the character never knew if he was actually turning into a wolf or not, and it was all played out much like the Val Lewton films to come. And of course, the success of The Wolfman inspired RKO to make Val Lewton go and do Cat People the next year in 1942. So it's interesting to see how that sort of flows in terms of inspiration, and sort of a lot of ideas were around at the same time at different studios. But that quality is still there in the film. Some people call it a sort of weakness, that we don't really see a transformation sequence. We don't really get much about the full moon. That would come later in the sequel, Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. But I really do think it's a strength, and it allows the character interactions and the depth of the characterization of Larry Talbot to come to the fore. And most rewarding for me is the primary characterizations of Larry Talbot, his relationship with the father character, Sir John, played masterfully by Claude Rains. Almost said Sir, he should have been knighted. And that just adds an extra layer of it being more of an A picture. And it's, of course, atmospheric out the wazoo. It's one of those films, you see it, you never forget that locale of the twisted dead trees shrouded in mist, and then you hear the howl of the wolf in the background. So really, I do think The Wolfman is the last sort of gasp of Universal making a horror film trying to achieve for like an A-picture status. And it doesn't quite have trying to think of the right word. It's got eloquence and it's got atmosphere. It just doesn't quite have that pure magic of the earlier films of the 30s, but of course most of those are primarily produced before the enforcement of the production code in 1934. So of course in 1941 you couldn't quite do that, and so with that sort of distinction in it being technically a new studio, the new Universal in quotes, I do think it is the last sort of gasp, the last truly great of the Universal horrors in the 1940s, in the Silver Age. But just a majestic film with one of the great endings of all time that is very Shakespearean in its impact, and it's one of those that never fails to just hit me like a load of bricks every single time. Coming in at number 7 is a film I champion. I find myself always bringing up. I think it's one of the most underrated films ever made, and that, of course, is 1939's Son of Frankenstein. This is the film that kickstarted what is now known as the Silver Age of horror, and Universal produced it with a large A budget as one of their prestige pictures of the year. It was almost shot in color, and actually I'm very glad it wasn't due to tests and budget and things. It's beautifully photographed in black and white, and really of the Frankenstein cycle of films, it is the third and really the last one that tries to aspire for being something greater and being a true A film about big ideas and big characterizations. Because after this, with Ghost of Frankenstein, the films really became the 40s Universal standard B film fare, or produced to be in double features for the kiddie market. And you can tell that drop off in quality when we go to the next film, Ghost of Frankenstein. But Son of Frankenstein, of course, is about the next generation essentially coming into Castle Frankenstein. And when you see it, it will be, of course, very familiar to fans of Young Frankenstein, because Son of Frankenstein was the inspiration and really the basic framework for 1974's Young Frankenstein. And I think that is the primary reason why it's not taken as seriously as it should be, because people see it and they immediately think of Young Frankenstein and all their favorite jokes and how it sort of lampoons and is genuinely affectionate towards the classic Universal style, but it makes it harder to go back to the 1939 mindset of seeing Son of Frankenstein. And if you're able to distance yourself, it's such a rewarding film, and it is beautifully photographed with lots of deep shadows. Even though the continuity in the castle and everything compared to the first two films, the James Whale films, is practically non-existent. They're basically retconning and rebooting here, as all the horror monster cycles would do in the Silver Age. But at least they did try to have some continuity, and but it's just a magical film experience. It really builds upon the lore to such a degree that it helps sell the fact that this is a reboot. And it definitely has a longer runtime, which was primarily because the director Roland Lee didn't really like the way the script treated Bela Lugosi's character of Igor, and they essentially built up the Igor character and a lot of other characterizations and things as they shot. So the film was a little bit over budget and a little bit over schedule, but it was a massive success and really launched horror as a viable genre again, and proved Universal could re-energize and turn the lights back on over their classic stable of monster characters. And another thing that really makes it special, you have multiple lead characterizations that are exceptionally strong. Of course, Karloff comes back for the third and final time as the creature. Unfortunately, he doesn't have the power of speech that he acquired in Bride. It's sort of a regression back to the silent mute type character that Karloff preferred from the original 1931 film. You also have the always incredible Lionel Atwill as Inspector Krogh, the one-armed, complete with prosthetic arm, chief inspector of the village of Frankenstein, plus, of course, all the various villagers and townspeople and town council. Then you have Basil Rathbone, and one of his really great dramatic roles. He's getting to play the hero this time. He doesn't have the villain role, which he would typically get saddled with, and he's not playing Sherlock Holmes. So it's a really nice chance to see Basil Rathbone in the lead of a film with the sort of dashing, heroic, traditional hero role, and he does wonderful things with it because, of course, the character gets sort of swept up in the family legacy and trying to clear his father's name, and of course he's a scientist as well, and so he sort of gets blinded by his trying to clear his father's name and his own scientific pursuits as well. And it's very believably done. It makes sense why he would do this and sort of lose sight of keeping his family safe, and that he is not his father. And there's an interesting way that the character's hubris is sort of played with. And again, it's very believably done. But of course, the film is entirely about and stolen by Bela Lugosi's Igor character. It is quite possibly the best performance he ever gave, even compared to Dracula. It is the primary reason why the film achieves greatness is this character of Igor, which is entirely created for the film, and just a majestic performance, characterization, backstory, everything. When you have all these characters on screen at the same time, it's fantastic. But when Lugosi enters as Igor, I mean, the film just completely becomes energized. So that's what really makes the film magic, and it builds to a truly great ending that, in a way, could be considered to cap off the Frankenstein cycle if you don't wish to continue with the later films, which I do also enjoy, but the quality drop-off is quite distinct after Son of Frankenstein. So that's why it's here in my top 10, and it is a truly underrated film, possibly the most underrated of all Universal horror films, because it doesn't get put out in most of the box sets, it doesn't get talked about as much, and it really should be, because it is a true classic, and it's one of the great films from the golden age year of 1939, so it could be technically considered the great horror film from the golden year of 1939. Coming in at number 6 is a film that most people today find a bit stodgy and a bit slow and very stagey, and everybody likes to tear it apart or poke fun at it and such, but I've always felt that Dracula is a great film, so that's why I have it here. It's a film that, yes, it's an early talkie, and yes, people like to say that Todd Browning was affected by the death of Lon Chaney Sr., and of course that's why Lugosi finally was given the role of Dracula. That he was too much of a silent film director, and there's no score in the film, and there's a lot of very stagey setups, and of course the film is based primarily on the stage play adaptation, even though it was reworked for the American market first, so it's not quite the British stage play. And that was all done out of budget constraints of the early years of the Depression, because the original plan was, of course, to try and adapt Bram Stoker's vast novel. But all that aside, there is such a great atmosphere in Dracula, and in the English language version directed by Todd Browning. And the sort of in thing to do is talk about the simultaneously produced Spanish version that was shot at night using the same sets. And when you directly compare the two, I really do think the Browning version is far superior in terms of atmosphere and pacing. The Spanish version does get to keep a lot of the deleted material that was removed from the English version by various censor boards and for time, but I think it runs much slower, and there are several cast members who are just not really that good at all, especially compared to the English language version. And most of those, several of those had been playing those roles on the stage, like Lugosi and Edward Van Sloan, who I also think is iconic as Professor Van Helsing. But I just think that its historical importance practically demands that it gets included here in this list. And I do think it's a much better film than people give it credit for. I think the silence really helps to just increase the atmosphere of many scenes to a ridiculous degree, so much so that I actually miss the audible hiss of the older versions from, actually transferring the original sound discs. I think the hiss itself was part of the character, and so while the digital cleanup is beautiful, I do miss the inherent noise of the sound floor of the original soundtrack. But of course, Lugosi is domineering every time he's on screen. You can't look away from him. It is an iconic performance, one of the iconic performances, and it's a much better film than I think people give it credit for. And of course, it was the first of the Universal horrors, and really jump started the entirety of the golden age of horror, of the Universal horror cycles. And it's one of the most important horror films ever made, quite possibly the most important horror film ever made, because it proved the validity of the genre in the talking era. So that's why it's here. It's a film I've watched practically my whole life. It's a film I'm probably obsessed with. It's become endearing in a lot of different ways. Even some of the characters people like to complain about, the way that David Manners plays Jonathan Harker is sort of wimpish. I find endearing now. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the incredible performance of Dwight Frye as Renfield, along with Edward Van Sloan and Bela Lugosi, the third of the truly iconic performances in this film. And so I think it completely towers over the Spanish version, which has the fancier camera movements and things like that. But of course, they had the ability to look at the rushes of the English version and try and top it. So that's why it's here on this list. It's a film I adore, and it's a film I wish more people would give a second chance to if they didn't like it the first time around, and not just just pile on the complaints. But it's a film that I think rewards multiple viewings. It really opens up over time, and I think it has incredible atmosphere. So at number 5, of course, is the original 1931 Frankenstein, which basically forms the 1-2 punch of Dracula and Frankenstein, starting the Universal horror cycle and the golden age of horror. Directed by James Whale. It's a film that I came to later in life. I had Dracula on tape very young, so I watched Dracula a lot. And then looking at Frankenstein, it's like you're seeing a film, 10 years later. Everything is such a lightning leap forward in quality and storytelling and characterization, camera movements, sound design, photography, everything. It is just an incredible film. It is quite possibly the best film of 1931. It's amazing for an early talkie, but of course I am biased because I think James Whale was a genius, and if anyone defined the term of auteur, even though I think that term has been so bastardized and overused, James Whale is perhaps the ultimate in that typical definition of auteur. And of course it gave us not one, but two fantastic, iconic, classic performances of the cinema, with Karloff becoming a star overnight as the titular creature of Frankenstein, and really giving a sense of pathos and tragedy to this character that did never asked to exist, and Colin Clive as the tortured and tragic Henry Frankenstein, doing a very interesting and wonderful characterization that sort of takes elements from the original Shelley novel, as they do with the characterization of the creature. But of course, the Shelley novel is quite long, and it's never quite been filmed, just like Dracula's original novel, the way it was written. But they do take key elements and ideas and themes from the original Shelley novel, and again, this is also primarily based on a stage play version, but I think it is much more adapted in the visual medium. It's obviously a stronger film over Dracula from its production standpoints on every single level, and it's just absolutely remarkable. It's it's absolutely perfect, really, and it's astonishing that it is a 1931 early talkie, and it really establishes the full-on gothic elements they're there in Dracula, but you really get the gothic sensibilities and the influence of German expressionism far more in Frankenstein than you do in Dracula. Gone is that sense of the stage bound, and it's incredibly well cast. It's just absolutely a fantastic experience, full of great ideas, and it's so phenomenal that Whale found it difficult and did not want to do a sequel. But since the film was an immediate success, Universal wanted a sequel, lickety split, and he sort of put it off and hemmed and hawed until they basically gave him carte blanche, and so he couldn't possibly say no. But it's just an incredible experience. It is not dated at all, and as with all these, I watch it every year. So that's why it's here at number 5. So at number 4 is another film that I feel gets some unfair criticism and definitely gets overlooked. And it's just a film I've been in love with ever since I first saw it as a kid on tape, even though it is very much, if you look at its plot and its characterizations, it's basically Dracula in Egypt. So, of course, I'm talking about the Karl Freund-directed 1932 original version of The Mummy, starring Boris Karloff. Again, it is very much, rather amusingly, Dracula 2.0, but it actually betters Dracula's structure and style in a lot of ways and increases the atmosphere even more, if that's possible. It's just a stunningly atmospheric film that has that emotional core to it, with the central character of Imhotep and his human guise, Ardith Bey, performed by Karloff in one of his absolutely majestic, iconic, greatest roles. It's just incredible, and the ability of the film to hold back, to allow suspense and atmosphere to rule over always showing the titular mummy and things, primarily in the iconic, truly famous opening of the film, really draws you in, and every single time it does make you feel like you are transported to another world. We of course don't get the now famous cut scenes from the film showing the past lives and reincarnated souls of the love of Imhotep, but even without that, it is just one of the most remarkably atmospheric films, I think, of the entire horror genre. And there's a poetic quality to it that, it does sort of touch the heartstrings a little bit with the inherent tragedy of the Imhotep character. But it's also interesting to note that the heroes of the film really they don't have that much they can do against Imhotep's magic and powers and things, so they are sort of powerless in that, but they still struggle and try anyway. You do have David Manners and Edward Van Sloan coming back as well, really furthering the Dracula connection. But Zita Johann playing the female lead has an entire air of mystery and this strange exotic quality that really befits the story notion of her being the reincarnation of Unxanamen in the modern day. So that's why I have it here at number 4. I think it's an incredible film. It really stands alone. It is unlike any of the other Universal films. It's a shame Karl Freund did not direct more. He was, of course, one of the great cinematographers and had already shot Dracula for Universal, but he does an incredible job. It's a incredible film experience, and it's just a film I've been in love with ever since I first saw it. And it's really the film that got me cemented on the Universal horrors, because I had already loved Dracula, but The Mummy is the film that really cemented that love and basically made me obsessed with learning as much as I possibly could about these films. So for the top 3, again, I am a self-admitted James Whale fanatic, so you'll probably know where this is going. Number 3 is the film I alluded to at the start of this. This is really sort of an outlier. It's not in any of the monster cycles of films, but it is a key title, and it is from the Golden Age of Horror, and it's from relatively early in the Universal horrors, so from 1932. This is a film that was extremely hard to see. It was thought lost for quite some time, and then for years, all we had was a very battered version on video that once I found it, I watched it religiously every year. And that, of course, is what I think is the 1932 masterpiece, The Old Dark House, directed by James Whale, and really just one of the most majestic, fun, macabre experiences in the entirety of the horror genre, giving you the standard idea of four people wind up trapped in a storm in the middle of nowhere, somewhere in Scotland or Wales, and have to hole up overnight at this creepy old dark house, and all of the eccentric, crazy characters that inhabit this completely strange environment. But what makes the film truly special is its sense of the bizarre, its sense of macabre, dark, black humor, and that undercurrent that's always there, but allows for genuine horror and frights to come through. So it's a very witty blend. It's very English. If you had to describe it, it's very much a British sense of humor or a British sensibility to the humor, which is why I think a lot of audiences in 1932 didn't latch onto it immediately. They come into it thinking, oh, this is going to be another Frankenstein or another Dracula. And they sold the film on it starring Boris Karloff. And Karloff has a more subservient role, literally, because he plays Morgan, the butler of the house. But it's one of those films I never wanted to spoil for people. I try to introduce as many people as I can to it. And now that it's been beautifully restored in 4K, the new Cohen Blu-ray and Masters of Cinema Blu-ray if you're in the UK, I mean, it is just stunning looking. And again, it was thought lost for some time. It was really Curtis Harrington, who was a friend of Wales, who loved the film. It was his efforts in the 1960s and 70s that really allowed the film to even be saved, because once the 1963 remake was done, which is just, let's not even go there in terms of its inferiority to the original film. It was suppressed like most films that were remade, and there was always a great chance back in the day of original films, once they're remade and suppressed, becoming lost or very difficult to see. So that happened with the old Dark House, and for years we had this terrible version on video. I think it was from like a 16 millimeter copy. But even then, it didn't diminish the film's impact and its charm and its delight. It's one of James Whale's masterpieces. You can feel his presence all over it, and it's beautifully shot by Arthur Edison, who had also shot Frankenstein for Whale. It's a full-on collaboration between every part of the cast and crew, and you also get the first real appearance of Ernest Thesiger in a Whale film, and the character he plays here is very much a sort of maybe a dry run, but there are elements of the supreme characterization of Dr. Pretorius from Bride of Frankenstein that would come later. So this is just one of those magical film experiences. If you've never seen it and you love Universal horror, you've got to check it out. If you're a fan of sort of the dark horror comedies that are very difficult to pull off, this is perhaps the supreme example of all of that. It is just one of the most signature film experiences you can ever have. There is nothing else in the world like the old Dark House, and it is just an absolute delight that we have this beautifully restored version and you can see it properly now, and thank God it was not lost. It is one of the great films, period, and one of my favorite film experiences to revisit every single Halloween. And as I alluded to before, this is the one film that is only available outside of the primary Universal Blu-ray box set and the various collections. So for this particular film and its absolute must-see restoration, you will have to turn to the Blu-ray from the Cohen Film Group here in the US. Trying to get to where there's no glare on it there. And in the UK, Masters of Cinema, or I should say the Eureka label, released it with a nice slipcover, but it's the same master and presentation. There are a handful of nice extras on here, and pretty much all the old ones from the old Kino DVD and Laserdisc from years past that had that very crummy 16mm print source version. This is a breathtaking restoration. If you don't believe in black and white restorations on Blu-ray, this film will change your mind. It looks completely brand new. It sounds brand new. And for my money, actually, the film that had the worst treatment on Laserdisc and DVD, that looked and sounded terrible for years, is now, when you compare this to the Blu-rays on the Universal set, and while those, to that release point in terms of the Blu-ray release was the best possible video picture quality for the classic monster horror films of the Universal canon, this actually vaults ahead of them. This is better than all of the Blu-rays in the complete Monster Legacy Collection box set combined, and that's really saying something. So now this is the one they have to live up to, and it would be beautiful to see this come to the UHD format, if at all possible, at some point in time. It's not really going to be a massive difference in terms of resolution, of course, because it's a 1932 film, but the increase in bandwidth and the ability to better show off the restored film would just be beautiful. But of course, this is going to be a very niche title for the ever-growing UHD format, I'll readily admit. But it's a beautiful release from Cohen or Eureka if you're in the UK, and it'll be the one title you will have to get outside of the primary box set in terms of the films I'm talking about here. So definitely do yourself a favor and get a copy of the Cohen Blu-ray release, and of course, have a potato. So we move on to my top two now, and since it should be no surprise where we're going, since they haven't been mentioned yet, and I've already admitted my undying love of the artistry of James Whale, the top two in my overall Universal Horror Top 10 should be no surprise to any fan of the films or the genre. So at number two, it is actually a relatively close race, but number two, I have 1933's The Invisible Man, which I think is an absolute start-to-finish masterwork. It is an absolutely incredible re-envisioning of H.G. Wells' original iconic novel, one of the great novels of science fiction. And I think it's the combination of James Whale's artistry and his masterful direction with the screenplay by the fantastic playwright R.C. Sheriff, who completely reinvents the spirit of H.G. Wells' novel and, to be honest, improves on it in every single facet by adding a greater degree of focus and making the Invisible Man himself a tragic figure that induces our sympathy as an audience, as opposed to simply being a frightful terror, as we see in the novel. So you get the tragic with the terrorizing. And that, combined with Whale's sense of the macabre and his sense of black humor, and the world the film creates of the small villages in England full of complete eccentrics that is hinted at in Wells's novel. It's there, but it's a much colder environment. The film, it's very warm, but it feels fully realized, and it's that extra element of the macabre and the black humor. It's basically blending, I think, elements of, say, the original Frankenstein that Well did in 1931, which was much more... You didn't really have as much of that macabre and that black humor. Then you got it in spades in The Old Dark House. So Invisible Man is sort of drawing from those two films. It's got one foot in the straightforward narrative of Frankenstein and one foot in the dark whimsy of The Old Dark House, if you want to put it that way. And it's combining those two with, again, an absolutely breathtaking, fantastic screenplay by R.C. Sheriff after many different writers did attempts that were all over the map in terms of general craziness. If you read about the various script drafts and the trouble they had in adapting The Invisible Man, it's insane to think that no one tried to simply adapt the book. And of course, thank goodness H.G. Wells had script approval this time and finally approved what Sheriff came up with. But again, Sheriff just enhances the drama across the board. It is without question, I think, one of the single greatest, if not the greatest cinematic adaptation that actually towers over the original literary work. It is an absolute masterclass in adapting an already truly great iconic novel. It's a film that is so fantastic that I hate to say it, but you really don't have to go back to the book. I still reread the book because I love H.G. Wells, but the film is such a complete experience that it towers over the original book. So you have all that on one hand, and then the other, you have the iconic performance of Claude Rains as the Invisible Man. That combined with the groundbreaking effects work of John P. Fulton, the first of the Invisible Man films, with effects that still hold up to this day, that have such an eeriness to them, it becomes all the more impactful when you know and you research the effects work and just how painstaking of a process it was to even achieve one shot. It's just absolutely incredible. And in particular, the extremely elaborate shots you have of the Invisible Man wrapping and unwrapping himself in front of a mirror, which required layer upon layer upon layer of effects work. And of course, meaning just hours and hours and hours of man hours put in. But it's all about Claude Rains' performance. And again, the Invisible Man in the film is a tragic character. Sheriff also introduces a love story subplot that helps to flesh out the character of Kemp and make him much more of a three-dimensional character. And he's not quite a villain either. It's really interesting, and this is one of those films where there's technically no one is good and no one is evil. There is no good guy and there's no bad guy. And since the Invisible Man is a tragic character, that the formula that made him invisible over time makes him more and more and more absolutely insane and gives him a complete power complex, it's fascinating to see this reflected in Rains' performance. And it becomes genuinely frightening because we fear not just for the effects and what the Invisible Man might do, but what is happening to the man himself, what is happening to the Jack Griffin character. And then you see him go past essentially the point of no return, and it's absolutely chilling. And this is all topped off by, again, that James Whale sense of the macabre. There are absolute hysterical, laugh out loud, funny moments that you never forget in this film. Just there are great chills and great sequences, and of course the greatest body count really of any of the classic Universal horror films, because the Invisible Man, does not. You can't reach him, you can't see him, and when he decides he wants to kill people, well, guess what? He just goes and does it. But he does so with this remarkable sense, again, of the macabre. And he doesn't just go around murdering people. He does other things. He upsets the establishment. He upsets society where possible. And of course, it seems his monomania affects him in different ways at different times. It's just a superbly, beautifully realized film that achieves a deep and unending eloquence. It's one of those films that every time I come to the ending, it genuinely affects me in an emotional way because it's so beautifully eloquent. It is just, without question, one of the treasures of the American cinematic landscape. It's not just one of the great horror films of all time. It's not just one of Whale's masterpieces. It's one of the greatest films of the 1930s. It's one of the greatest films ever made. It has not aged. It has not diluted one percentage. And again, you have to look at the performance of Claude Rains, which is, of course, entirely by voice. It is only visibly seen at the very ending of the film, which was not very good for his ego for his American film debut, practically. But that voice, it's such a performance. And then when you physically see the Invisible Man moving around when he's in bandages, it speaks volumes. But when the Invisible Man speaks, it is so layered and so richly textured with that inimitable, absolutely iconic tone that was always in Claude Rains' voice. That sense, that velvety feel. But when he's playing the Invisible Man, even individual words in a sentence can range from laughing to humor to suspicion to distrust to eventually monomania, rage, anger, and violence, all in the space of a single sentence. There are several fantastic scenes, but in particular, when he finally is able to see his great love Flora again, and she sees him in as the Invisible Man, and he starts out very much, recounting why this has happened to him, and they have a very romantic moment, but then you can feel the effects of the drugs taking over again, and the monomania returns, and he goes off kilter again, and he starts speaking of mad visions of power, and even his physical body movements change, the way he's moving around, because again, he's wrapped in bandages. And the ability to do this in terms of just physical performance and voice without having the face. You know, the great tool of all actors is the face, all human expression of the face. To not have that and to be able to still project one of the most vivid characterizations, I think, of the entire horror genre is just absolutely incredible. But of course, I may be biased. I think Claude Rains is one of the greatest film actors, one of the greatest actors of all time. But it's just a central, iconic performance, and again, one of the great masterworks to be forever enjoyed of the cinema. And were it not for the next horror film that James Whale would do, where he went to even higher flights of artistic fancy, The Invisible Man, I think, would be the greatest of all the Universal horror films. As it is very close. It is my number 2. And if you prefer films that are a bit straighter in terms of their narrative and not getting too whimsical, some people might prefer this to my number 1 choice, which I can understand. But again, it is just, I think, the perfect balance of a really driving narrative, an iconic classic original story, an iconic lead performance by Claude Rains, and the James Whale touch and that touch of the whimsical. So it all comes together in The Invisible Man, which again, I think is just an absolute masterpiece and one of the true great film adaptations that I think actually does surpass the original novel. And so, of course, number 1, again, should be no surprise to anyone who's a Universal fan or knows where I'm going with this. But of course, number 1 is 1935's Bride of Frankenstein. James Whale's artistic triumph, his desire to not make a Frankenstein sequel eventually forced the studio to basically give him carte blanche to do whatever he wanted to do. And telling James Whale or anyone like that, basically, here's a blank check just as long as you make a sequel. He basically took everything I mentioned in The Invisible Man, takes it up to the stratosphere, and makes a movie exactly the way he wanted to. And in a lot of ways, he's almost, or the film, I should say, is almost not quite satirizing, but there is an element of almost sending up elements of the Universal horror films in the original Frankenstein, because Whale didn't really want to make horror films anymore, and he had to be really convinced into doing something. There had to be something in it for him. And it's this particular quality where the whimsical, where the macabre is elevated to such a degree. Some people want to label it as camp humor, which I think it's definitely an argument you can make. I don't know if it's necessarily camp humor itself, but I think it's Whale's sensibilities just raised to a maximum. And that, combined with it being a truly great sequel to the original film that does incorporate elements of Shelley's original novel that were not used, such as the creature learning its first words and actually being able to speak, and giving an even greater sense of pathos and tragedy to Karloff's original mute characterization, was a masterstroke and just elevates it that much further over the original film. Karloff felt that was a mistake at first, but I think it's an even greater performance than his first performance. While he was absolutely incredible at being able to convey emotions in this newborn creature completely without dialogue, for me, it's the addition of the dialogue, much as in Shelley's original novel, the creature learning to be able to articulate itself for the first time, and then attempting to do so with others, and then finally with his own original creator, is the most moving parts for me of the original Shelley book. So to see that in cinematic form with the Karloff creature, it just makes it an even more emotional experience for me. And this is an emotional film on top of everything else, but it's also an extremely intelligent one and an extremely cynical one in a lot of ways. And that, of course, is represented in human form by one of the absolute supreme characters of the cinematic lexicon. Of course, I'm referring to Ernest Thesiger as Dr. Pretorius, who I think you could almost say is perhaps the James Whale surrogate in the film's story, in the way that he reacts to everything as if it is almost beneath him, and with a element of charming yet cynical disdain of sorts. And it's great to see Theskar come back. Pretorius is, in some ways, you could say a riff or a greater, more built-up version of the character he plays in the Old Dark House. Maybe look at that as a work-in-progress version towards the eventual Dr. Pretorius. But Pretorius is one of the great anti-heroes. He's such a fascinating, wonderful character. He's pretty much a devil in human form, but he's so damn charming that you just absolutely adore him from the first minute. Even though you know he will lead Colin Clive's Henry Frankenstein back down the path to hell, as it were. It's just a supreme characterization and one of the many elements that make Bride of Frankenstein so rewarding. Again, you have Colin Clive with his incredible characterization of Henry Frankenstein here, a bit older and definitely world weary after the events of the first film. It is technically a direct sequel, but it is picking up several years, 4 years after the original film's production. So, of course, the continuity isn't perfect. And we've also changed lead actresses as well, because Frankenstein's wife, Elizabeth, instead of being played by Mae Clarkes in the original, is now played by Valerie Hobson. But that stuff actually helps give Bride more of its own identity, and it's interesting that it is directly connected to the original Frankenstein, and then also kind of goes off and does its own thing all over the place. So it's nice to see some continuity, but I like that Bride is sort of going off in its own particular universe. In terms of its story, it has more, basically the second half of all the iconic events that people associate with the Frankenstein films that are not in the first film. So if you go and you see these films for the first time, I still remember, when I would see Frankenstein or Bride. I actually saw Bride before I saw Frankenstein, actually. One has most of the famous moments, and then the other has all the other ones that you know of or remember or know of just in popular culture. But practically every scene in Bride is a showstopper in terms of characterization or iconic events or things that have become cliches. But everything is increased in quality and production over the original film, which already itself was mesmerizing. But Karloff's performance and even the Jack Pierce makeup is far more advanced over the original film. And interestingly, you see it over time start to regenerate, because it does start distressed after the fire of the first film, leaving the creature barely alive and burned at the start of it. So you see it actually regenerate over the course of the film. And of course, the makeup and iconic hairdo of the bride herself. But also, it's a more literate, a more intelligent film with things like the opening, with actually seeing Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley and Lord Byron and the original conception of the Frankenstein story, and making it essentially a bookend to open the film and lead us back into it. That was something Whale really wanted to have and insisted upon having, even though most other people really didn't understand its inclusion. But it's telling you right off the bat that this is a different type of film. It's a more of a prestige production. And I think prestige is a great way to describe describe Bride. It is it towers so far above even the other Universal horror films. It seems like it's made in a different era. It seems like it's made by a different company in a lot of ways, because it is truly superior. It is a super film. It also features an absolutely iconic, fantastic, complete score by Franz Waxman. Most of the other films, the early films like Dracula and Frankenstein did not have scores. They had some incidental music, and then Invisible Man did have a partial score, which is fantastic. But it really is Bride of Frankenstein that kicks off the Universal horrors, actually having full orchestrated scores, and Waxman's score is just majestic and fits the film perfectly, and goes from the brazen Frankenstein, I believe it's the 5-note Frankenstein theme that he created, to a beautiful theme for the bride, beautiful incidental music for the period opening, and lurking danger chords when, say, for example, the creature is being hunted by the villagers, and then absolute tug at the heartstrings moments. Particularly the chief moment of all is, of course, when the creature is wounded and finds himself confronted by the old blind man in the hut. Scene that was, of course, lampooned in Young Frankenstein beautifully, but it's one of the most delicate scenes I've ever seen in any film. It's one of the scenes that reduces me to tears every time I see it. I can't help it because it is so beautifully played. And again, sort of resurrecting the spirit of a similar scene in the novel, where we see the creature first learn how to speak by observing other human beings. Here it's made much more direct, and it's really the only truly happy and time for the creature to coexist in its entire life up to that point. And of course, the entire time that it cannot last. So it's Bride is a film that can pack emotional punches like that, along with all the James Whale touches. I should also mention the supporting cast is first rate and increasing the level of eccentricity that we saw in The Invisible Man. You have many James Whale favorites pop up, like E.E. Clive, and of course the indomitable Una O'Connor, who was in Invisible Man and let her iconic shrieking come into that film quite a bit rather memorably. But apparently James Whale loved that so much that they decided to crank that up to 11. And so I think in this film, you have what is quite possibly the greatest number of shrieks and fantastic over the top shriekings you will ever see in any film. To a degree that some people find it annoying, but I don't see how it's possible because Una O'Connor is so endearing in these films. But in Bride, particular, as Minnie, she literally shrieks everyone into oblivion beautifully. I would also be remiss if I did not take a moment to mention the absolutely staggering photography of John Mescal in Bride of Frankenstein. Whale normally at this point would collaborate with the legendary Arthur Edison, as he did on Frankenstein and The Invisible Man. But the Bride was shot by John Mescal, who used a different type of lighting. He referred to it as Rembrandt lighting, but using a similar style of lighting on the faces as Rembrandt would in his famous paintings. And it results in just an incredible, very intricate photographic style. There's a greater feel of silver and grayscale in Bride's photography. There is no other Universal film that is as intricately photographed in the Universal horror films, even going into the 40s where film stocks got better and things. It is just from a photographic standpoint, it is the best of the Universal horrors. It is just so absolutely gorgeous and stunning to look at. You could take practically any frame or setup from this film, hang it on the wall in an art museum, which, admittedly you could with most of the Universal horror films. But Bride in particular is the most exquisitely photographed of all of the horror films. And it's a shame that Mescal did not do more of the classic horror films, because he really achieved something with Bride photographically. So again, this is a film that rises above the others, not just artistically, not just because of its greater layering of themes and its characterization and the sense of whimsy and James Whale being able to do whatever really the heck he wanted to do, just as long as he made a Frankenstein sequel. But it is a prestige A feature. It has a fantastic score and fantastic photography. It is exquisitely crafted all around 100%. And again, all under the vision of James Whale. I don't like when people throw around the terms director's vision and auteur theory and stuff, because it just becomes so overutilized and overused and bastardized. But when you look at what a James Whale production meant, and you look at what he did and how he had his hand in every aspect, from character design, helping develop the various makeups for the creature, for the bride, his directing of the actors, his directing of the various property teams, his hand in the set design, his hand in the photography, his hand in the music scoring. There are literally photographs with him with Franz Waxman during the recording sessions for the score. Directors didn't go to those links unless you were the best of the best and you truly and absolutely cared. And if anyone in the world ever defines the term auteur, if there's anything to auteur theory, being involved in every single aspect of a film, that by the time you finish that film, every single time you see it, you felt like you've spent the evening with that particular person. You feel like you've gotten such a sense of them that you know them in a particular way. It is James Whale in that film as Bride of Frankenstein. Other people have said that. They say that in the commentary. I hope I'm not paraphrasing it too badly from Scott McQueen's just amazing commentary track. But I think that summarizes the film perfectly, because that's how I've always felt. I've been in love with this film since the first time I saw it. I said before that The Mummy is the film that cemented my love of the Universal horrors. When I saw Bride of Frankenstein, it was one of those life-changing moments. It's one of those films you see that you realize that great films don't just affect you. They don't just move you, and they don't just, burn themselves into your brain. They almost become a part of you, and they enrich your life to such a point that you are not the same person that you were when you went into it, and they continue to always inspire. And Bride of Frankenstein is where I knew horror films could be art and should be recognized as art. That's why I think it's not just one of the great films, not just one of the great films of the 30s and James Whale's artistic masterpiece. I think it's the greatest horror film ever made. It defies real classification. It is a horror film, but it's also a romance. It's also a tragedy. There are some science fiction elements, of course, because it is Frankenstein, but there's genuine pathos and feeling, and a sense of the poetic, a sense of the bizarre as well. It's absolutely wicked in ways. It's wickedly funny, almost blasphemous in certain elements with the Pretorius character. You have two tragic arcs, both of Henry Frankenstein and his creature. The film is full of sublime performances, iconic moments, iconic characters, and is without question the summit, the pinnacle, the peak, the crown jewel of the Universal horrors. So there is nothing else that can be number one. It is 1935's Bride of Frankenstein, which is still to this day a film that moves me, entertains me, makes me laugh until I can't breathe and bawl my eyes out. And it builds to one of the great endings of all of cinema. I think The Invisible Man has another of the great endings, but Bride of Frankenstein has an absolutely incredible ending that manages to close the film on the absolute perfect grace note that has, again, the elements of pathos, the feeling that you have just experienced something, and you feel the genuine tragedy and sadness. And since Frankenstein is one of the great novels like Dracula that's never truly been, properly adapted in its original form, everybody always changes it or does stuff to it. There are some that get pretty close, but I really do think Bride of Frankenstein is the great Frankenstein film because it manages to achieve a lot of the same tonal results as the novel. You get that same emotional punch when you get to the end of the original book, even though the events are totally different. There is a resonance there. You have that in the original 1931 Frankenstein, but it's a much more straightforward film experience. But in Bride of Frankenstein, they're just all of the majestic elements come together and result in 75 some odd minutes of pure absolute magic that really, I think, represents James Whale more completely than any other film he made. Most of his other films are unfortunately rather obscure. You can't really see most of them, but he is primarily known for his horror films, and that's not a bad legacy because Again, Bride of Frankenstein is truly just a complete work of art in every sense of the word, and it is, again, it's the crown jewel of Universal horror, and just an absolute magical experience every year when I come back to it. So that concludes my top 10 favorite and best Universal horrors. Of course, primarily what you have to do now in terms of video releases is just go and get a copy of what's named the Classic Monsters Complete 30 Film Collection on Blu-ray. This compiles all the individual cycle volumes based around each character that have been done, of course, first on DVD, then on Blu-ray. These are the best the films have looked on video to this point. All the subjects of restorations, that they're not perfect, but they are the best the films have looked in until this point. Of course, with every restoration, you can compare to older releases, and these films have been reissued so many times and were so damaged over the years that while the restorations are mostly great, they're not perfect, and so I do enjoy looking at some of the older versions sometimes out of nostalgia, or looking at versions with maybe less overzealously cleaned up audio tracks and such. But of course, now it being 2021, we've just seen the first of the films to be released on the 4K UHD format. Although oddly, Universal has decided to just release 4. I don't know if that's just because they finished these 4 first, or they decided to do just 4 at a time. Normally, they release the main films together. So this 4K set is noticeably just Dracula, Frankenstein, and then the Invisible Man and the Wolf Man. But of course, it also does include the Spanish version of Dracula that always gets bundled with Dracula now, since it was rediscovered and restored first in 1992. So it's technically 5 films on 4K, and they do have some new work. I have looked at the reviews, and it seems very promising. It seems like they do unfortunately have the same audio tracks as what's on Blu-ray, which is no real surprise. And they're fine and solid audio tracks, but I do wish they had gotten more attention to detail and not gotten so overzealously cleaned up. But in terms of picture quality benefits, it does look like there have been some distinct improvements. The Wolfman fares best because that is a Blu-ray that unfortunately has not held up very well. It is the one of the main films that definitely sticks out on Blu-ray with not having as good of a transfer. And so that one I think is the biggest night and day improvement. But all the films overall have distinctly improved in terms of shadow detail, grayscale, really presenting the visuals with much greater texture. You're not really seeing a major uptick in resolution because you're talking about films from the 30s and 40s, and everybody would say the same thing. There's not really 4K level of resolution there in the materials you're having to work with. And also for most of the earlier films in particular, you're not working from original camera negative, which is long gone or destroyed. You're working from various protection elements or several generations away, so that's another limitation. Also, the intensive damage on these from the popularity and the censored bits of footage that had to be restored and found and put back in to say Frankenstein or Dracula causes other problems, or the effects work in the Invisible Man films. So there's a lot of outliers and a lot of things that will keep them from looking absolutely pristine. But it's fantastic to see them coming into the 4K format. One would hope that eventually we'll just have this, but it'll be a 4K banner on top, and we'll have at least what they like to say is the complete 30 films of the monster cycles and Universal horror all together in one 4K package. It could happen. It's definitely going to take a while for some of the other films to hit. I do think there'll be a wave 2 eventually, and when we get Bride in 4K, it's going to absolutely be insanely amazing to see John Mescal's photography in 4K with all of the additional wonderful parts of that format in terms of really opening up the transfer and the restoration of the film. And I'm hoping that it does manage to fix some of the quirks and things from this Blu-ray set, which again, it's not perfect, but it is the best the films have looked up until this point, with the exception of the new 4K titles, the 5 films that are in the new 4K set. So if you're wanting to get these films on disc somehow, this is going to be your best bet for now. It frequently goes on sale around October or Halloween, and it's definitely what you need to have on your shelf. And it's great to have them all in one place. And of course, you can go the DVD route if you want to, but now that this is available and goes for relatively very cheaply, sometimes under $50, this is the way to go, and you get all of the various sequels and the character cycles. So that is my top 10 for Universal Horror. Again, I am just barely going into detail on these films. I feel like I've really skipped out on some, just simply trying to do a straightforward top 10 with a little bit of my own personal attachment for each. This is not meant to be one of my usual long videos. I'm trying to make it a little shorter to just keep it a standard top 10. So make of that what you will. And definitely leave any comments below if you want to talk about your own favorite Universals or make your own top 10 list. This was really difficult to do because I adore all these films. And again, you become fascinated with the whole Universal horror cycle and eras, and the more you look into it and the more you rewatch these films, you start to fall in love with other films. You start to have an appreciation for films that you don't like all that much, or they all grow on you. You have an affection for all of them, even if some of the later films, the quality really takes a nosedive. But, you know, I found myself having certain affections for even the house films at the very tail end of the monster cycles in Universal Horror. So they all grow on you. They all have their fans, and it's fascinating to discuss them with other people. So that's why I wanted to put this together, and I would love to hear anybody else's Universal Horror top 10 from the classic films. So as always, thank you ever so much for watching, and keep enjoying classic horror films in October, in spooky season, for Halloween, and year-round really, because it's always time for Universal Horror. And he seemed to be saying to me, "Rats, rats, rats, thousands, millions of them. All these will I give you, if you will obey me."
He's crazy.
They're all crazy. They're all crazy, but you and me. Sometimes I have me doubts about you.
Yes.
Even a man who is pure in heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the autumn moon is bright.
I cough. You see, bone gets stuck in throat.
Nothing the burgomaster has to say could be of the slightest importance.
He went for a little walk. You should have seen his face.
I was booted out. Booted, dear Baron, is the word for knowing too much. To a new world of gods and monsters.